Another film I had not even heard of until recently, but also seems to have a cult following. Sort of spiritual, sort of science fiction, sort of just weird. Around the same time that Star Trek IV hit the screen and trounced the movie Solar Babies, also was trounced Charlie Sheen, Sherilyn Fenn, Randy Quaid, 1986, The Wraith. The Wraith opens with a scene of a drag race being forced on a young man with his girlfriend who has been in the car as one of the possible prizes. The threat of you lose the race, you lose your car. It's a very 1980s street racing sort of make-believe situation, but the stakes are unusually high. Based on everything you saw, if you saw the trailer, if you saw the posters, you don't expect this degree of heaviness, and it doesn't quite fit with the teenagers involved, or at least the actors playing the teenagers that are supposed to be involved. It doesn't, something feels a little bit excessively dark, and you watch it unfold. Ultimately, there is a murder. The young man is dead. The girl is gone to God knows what happened to her at the hands of this ruffian drag racing gang of guys. And then our film opens with the arrival of a strange entity, apparently from outer space, zooming around a ball of energy that then takes on form and drives into town, and it's Charlie Sheen. Charlie Sheen in human form now encounters Sherilyn Fenn's character Carrie. We learn pretty quickly about the ruffian head of the gang is a real psychopath and is very much not her boyfriend, but a man who believes that he owns her and controls her through violence, through threats of violence, and just pathological, psychological abuse. It has actually been likened to the film High Plains Drifter. We might also say perhaps then Pale Rider, that would come later, because that's connected. Because now Charlie Sheen is this creature, the Wraith, a Wraith, who has a motorcycle, but then shows up in an incredibly, almost supernaturally powered, science fiction appearing automobile. He takes on the drag racing gang, and bit by bit, he kills them all off in a bloody revenge to liberate the girl, played by Sherilyn Fenn. To liberate Carrie, he finally then tells her that he is Jamie, back from the dead, and now they can live happily ever after. They make out and they head out somewhere. He leaves his magic alien car to the surviving brother after telling him who he really is. I'm going to be totally honest in this. I had to back this thing up a couple of times because the best I can figure, there's no explanation given for why Charlie Sheen does not look like the guy killed at the beginning. What happened to that blonde girl and why Sherilyn Fenn is now the girl he's come back for. Not very well expressed on film. The best I can gather is, well, the people at the beginning are not the people the movie is about. There are flashbacks to the death of Jamie, also Jake, also played by Charlie Sheen, that don't mesh with the beginning opening scene completely. You think it's parts you didn't see, and then you're like, oh, these are other victims. I think the beginning of the film, the victims of the gang that we saw go through this misery and suffering and death, they're not the Wraith and they're not Carrie. They were different victims of the same people, but still no explanation given why Charlie Sheen doesn't look like Jamie when he's Jake. No explanation of where his power comes from. The evidence is not strong enough to say, like High Plains Drifter or Pale Rider, it's supernatural and he has returned from the grave. It gives you so many extraterrestrial seeming elements that you think he's kind of Green Lantern who discovered the rain. It's really rather confusing of a flick. So the basic moral tale is there. There's a ruffian street game that is brutalizing people, even to death. I mean, this is dark stuff. Controlling this woman through force and pathological behavior. I mean, this is deep stuff. And the dead guy back from the dead to get bloody revenge on the bad guy, and he does, and they live happily ever after. The problem is that everything in the middle, Sherilyn Fenn, who'd be in like just one of the guys and some of those other teen romance, the situation we're given with her where this guy is literally threatening her, stalking her, saying that he owns her. He cuts himself and dribbles blood and smears it on her lips. I mean, this is really dark stuff that you don't expect with these teenagers or teenage-ish performers playing these high school kids. I mean, it's like Grease gone horribly, horribly wrong in some parallel universe. But it isn't. Overall, the ambiance of the film isn't dark enough to justify it or to carry it. It like comes out of nowhere and it's just there. And so you have these very brutal, violent, and very manipulative and cruel threads weaving through this story. And yet the revenge you get of exploding cars and all of that is more like a relatively light action adventure sort of violence. It just doesn't really fit. In the end, I think this is what the Wraith struggles with. And it reminded me a lot of Solar Babies, which I just saw, and I think just yesterday reviewed, so it's fresh in my mind. But being that same era, that same time frame, and Solar Babies, The Wraith, both of these are films that had a lot of elements that could have been explored further or better. The Wraith could have been a very fabulous movie, dropping the confusing sci-fi part, having him come back, having some description of why he has to look different, and having the whole thing be darker to fit what was done, what was ongoing, and the vengeance of our protagonist. Or you could have made it a little bit lighter and took out those heavier elements and made it more like a teenage romantic angsty movie with the drag racing and appealed to that market. Ultimately, the car, the outfit, the setup, everything is way too cool for the way that it was used. That's the best way to sum it up. So it does have a cult following. There's a lot of people that love it. There is the story I saw online is that it might be considered a sequel or reimagining because Martin Sheen played in a movie with a similar plot, a made-for-TV movie decades before called The California Kid. But The Wraith contains all these basic elements. I'd have to say our villain does a fabulous job of being a psychopath. It just doesn't seem to jive well with the overall. It's like it can't decide what kind of film it wants to be. It's not a horror film, a horror revenge film. It's not a sci-fi film. It's not a teenage love film. It's like all of these things thrown in a blender, but it doesn't flow. It just doesn't mix very well. But it's interesting watch. It's out there. It's available. Amazon Prime is where I found it, included with Prime. Check it out. Maybe you saw this and you loved it in the 80s. Let me know what you think. Otherwise, check it out and then let me know what you think. The Wraith.